Let's look at the conversation between the United States and Britain,
Yeah,
music, what led to what, and back and forth
yeah.
from as early as you can think of.
Well, the conversation between Britain and the States was rather one-sided for a long time because of a mutual ban that came into in the 1930s between the two countries' musicians' unions, which meant that, for example, when Ray Noble, the British band leader from the 30s, went over to the States, he had to hire an entire band of American musicians. It was just Ray Noble, the conductor, and Al Bowley, the singer, who were allowed over. And actually, the Glenn Miller Orchestra. Glenn Miller was Ray Noble's band leader in America, and his group built up from that, basically. But for a long time, this meant that you couldn't have bands and musicians moving back and forth between the two countries.
Was that both directions, or
Both directions, yeah.
so? If Glenn Miller and his orchestra wanted to play in the UK, he could not.
No, they couldn't. There was a total ban on American musicians playing in Britain or British musicians playing in America. And this lasted until the late 50s, at which point you have people like Lonnie Donegan had a hit in the States. He was allowed to go over to America. The ban was strictly for musicians, so it didn't affect singers. So like Johnny Ray could come over to Britain and perform, but he couldn't bring any musicians with him. And when Lonnie Donegan went over to the States to perform, he did a few TV shows and stuff. He had to be backed by the Johnny Burnett Trio. He wasn't allowed to play his guitar. He was only allowed to sing. But this meant that the cultural transmission was basically one way, America influencing Britain and not the other way around. Because you had Hollywood films coming over here and people would hear music in those. You had also the Armed Forces Network Radio in Western Europe. You had a lot of American service bases in Britain and also in Germany and stuff. You could hear German radio from Britain. So people would hear American radio a lot, but Americans wouldn't hear British music. And so the influence was all very much one way, but it was sort of a dilute influence and an influence without the proper cultural context, which meant that the British people were picking up a lot of weird ideas about what American music actually was. There's a line that I often quote, which I think was Charles Shaw Murray said it first. I can't, if I'm wrong. It was somebody said it, but I quote the line often. When Bo Diddley sings "I'm a man," he means "I'm a man, so don't call me boy honky." When the Yardbirds sing "I'm a man," they mean "I'm a grown man now, mummy, so you can't make me tidy my room." You know, British people were taking these American things without the context of the culture from which they came and building a new culture in their imagination from it. And early on in Britain, much of the early British rock and roll was awful, just really, really bad. And weirdly, a lot of early British rock and roll was attempts at copying Bill Haley and the Comets, or even like Bill Haley and the Comets imitators like Freddie Bell and the Bellboys, rather than copying Elvis or people like that. In the late 50s, though, you start to get the first little bits of two-way transmission because the musicians' unions, I think it was 1956, it might have been a year or two later, but they came up with a one-in, one-out system where an American musician could play Britain if a British musician was allowed to go over and play America. And the musician had to be somebody who played the same instrument. So, Louis Armstrong could come over and play Britain, but there was some random trumpet player from Devon who got to go and tour America. Otherwise, Louis Armstrong would be putting this trumpet player out of business, which of course is a nonsense. He's Louis Armstrong. Trumpet players are not fungible, but that was the ruling. And so then you start getting people like Buddy Holly and Eddie Cochran and so on coming over here. And what tends to happen is it tends to be the American artists who are slightly past their prime in the States still have some glamour in Britain as an American rock and roll hero. So, Gene Vincent, one-hit wonder in the US, Bebop Alula, then nothing else. 2 years later, he's coming to Britain and he's headlining and he's a massive star, and he brings Eddie Cochran over, who, again, in the States was not a big star at the time. And just this phenomenon over here. And they end up performing over here a lot. And those particular performers tend to shape what British rock and roll becomes. And so you have a lot more influence of people like Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent, and of the American blues musicians that Chris Barber got to bring over. People like Muddy Waters, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Otis Spann. They have an outsized influence in Britain because they're the ones that you can go and see. Elvis isn't touring Britain because Elvis can make, well, also because the Colonel would be arrested for murder if he'd left America. But Elvis wasn't touring Britain because he could make enough money in America. But Gene Vincent was touring Britain. So Gene Vincent becomes this big, massive thing over here because you can go and see him, but he's a proper American rock and roller. And then very slowly, you start getting British records being released in America, but they tend to be weird things like Telstar by the Tornadoes, or like Lonnie Donegan records. Yeah, and they're not part of a big thing. You do occasionally get Americans covering British records, like Del Shannon covered the Beatles before the Beatles had a hit in the States, because people of that era are always on the lookout for a big hit song from somewhere, but it tends to be cover versions rather than the records themselves. And it's only really when the Beatles hit America that the influence becomes two-way in early '64. That's also the time when there becomes far more interconnection between the two countries, because suddenly a lot of American promoters desperately want a lot of British musicians, which means that a lot of American musicians have to be able to play in Britain. So you get a lot more travel back and forth between the two countries, a lot more musicians from one country playing the other as a result of that. And eventually in like the mid 70s, the musicians union thing, they just say, fine, whatever, you can play wherever. But that restriction, and then the slight loosening of that restriction, is what leads to the feedback becoming two-way rather than one-way.